Hey there, Bible nerds. Welcome to Chapters and Chuckles by Kaye, where you dive into the Bible chapter by chapter and find joy along the way. So, this is episode 3, and today we're diving into Genesis chapters 3 to 15. So, buckle up because we've got everything from a massive tower construction project gone wrong to an adventurous road trip with Abram to battles, blessings, and a really dramatic contract signing under the stars. I'm your host on this journey, here to break down these ancient stories in a fun, relatable way. So grab your coffee or tea or water, get comfy, and let's jump right into the action. Chapter 11: The Tower of Babel and a Scattered People. The chapter opens with all the people of the earth speaking one language. Imagine that. No awkward Google Translate needed, no, hand signing and all that. Everyone understood each other perfectly. As they migrated together, they found a nice plain in a land called Shinar, which is basically ancient Babylon, and decided to settle there. And then came a bold group project. One said, "Come on, let's build a city and a tower that reaches the heavens so we'll make a name for ourselves," he said. They wanted to be famous and stick together rather than spreading out over the earth as, God had instructed after the flood. So they started building this mega tower. Think of it as the first attempt at a skyscraper, or maybe the first failed DIY project on a grand scale. So they used, baked bricks, baked bricks and asphalt for mortar. High tech for their time, I believe so. In fact, the bricks were power. Oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? Waterproof. The bricks were waterproof. Perhaps they thought a flood wouldn't catch them off guard again. I could just imagine, one maybe engineer saying, "We'll make it flood proof just in case God changes his mind about that whole no more flood promise," something like that. So the idea was to build a tower with its top in the heavens. Whether they literally aimed for the heaven or just wanted, an astrology observatory up high of sorts. One thing's clear though, pride and ambition were the foundation stones of this project. They were like, we'll be unstoppable if we stick together. Essentially trying to outsmart and outscale God. Well, God took note of their little enterprise. The Bible humorously says, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower," as if God, had to stoop down to this puny tower humans thought was so tall. Ironic. Humans try to go up and then God still has to come down to see it. It's funny. Seeing their, arrogant unity, God said, "If as one people with one language they've begun to do this, nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Let's go down and confuse their language." Suddenly, mid-construction, workers started speaking different languages. Like uno, dice, hola, otro, blah, blah, blah. Complete gibberish to each other. You can imagine the chaos. The bricklayer yells for mortar, but the helper has no clue what mortar means in their tongue. It's the ultimate communication breakdown. The project ground, to a halt fast. Instead of, one united city, people clustered with those they could understand and eventually scattered all over the world. They called the place Babel, which in Hebrew sounds like the word for confusion. And yes, that's where we get the verb to babble from. Pretty fitting. It was actually, I thought that was very interesting when I learned that, because I use that all the time when, my daughter is just babbling on and on and on. So in a fun twist, the ancient Babylonians name for Babylon Babili meant gate of God. But the Bible makes a pun out of its confusion. Um, you know, talk about wordplay or divine wordplay. The Great Tower, left unfinished, stood as a monument not to human glory but to human folly. God's intervention at Babel put a check on human arrogance and forced people to spread out, just as He intended. After the Babel story, which only takes up to 9 verses, chapter 11 gives us a family tree, a genealogy again from Noah's son Shem down to a man named Terah, and Terah's son Abram. Our next big protagonist. We learned that Abram's family originally lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is ancient Mesopotamia. Terah took Abram's wife Sarai, and Abram's nephew Lot, and they migrated northwest to a place called Haran, where Terah eventually died. This genealogy sets the stage for what's coming. God is about to zoom in on Abram's story as the next chapter unfolds. Here's some fun facts. According, which I've already talked about this before, but according to ancient tradition recorded by historian Josephus, Nimrod was the ringleader at Babel. So I've talked about Nimrod, I believe, in the last episode. He supposedly wanted to build a tower high enough to survive any future flood and avenge himself on God. That's one epic act of rebellion, um, and perhaps a bit of an overreaction, by Nimrod. So while the Bible doesn't name Nimrod in the Babel story, he is mentioned earlier as a mighty king who founded Babel or Babylon. So the Tower of Babel is often believed to have been a type of ziggurat, so a Mesopotamian step pyramid. Archaeologists have found that kiln-fired bricks and tar were common building materials in ancient Babylon, just as Genesis describes. And that is it for chapter 11. Now let's talk about chapter 12, the call of Abram, road trip, and risks in Egypt. So, enter Abram, one of the most important figures in Genesis. Chapter 12 kicks off with a game changing moment. God speaks to Abram, and not with a small request either. God basically says, leave your country, your family, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. In other words, pack your bags, buddy, where I'm embarking on a journey. God also makes staggering promises to Abram. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. But that is a lot to take in. Essentially, God is launching, plan A to restore blessing to the world after the whole Eden and flood and, Babel stuff. And Abram is the chosen partner for this plan. Um, so amazingly, of course, Abram obeys. At this point, he is 75 years old, no less. So proof that grand adventures with God aren't just for the young. So Abram departs from Haran with his wife Sarai, who is about 65, and her nephew, or his nephew Lot, along with all their possessions and servants. They head towards Canaan, the land God hinted at. You can picture them loading up camels and donkeys, saying goodbye to their families, and stepping into the unknown purely on trust. When Abram finally arrives in Canaan, he travels through the land, stopping at places like Shechem and later Bethel. The Canaanites are living there. God appears to Abram and confirms, to your descendants I will give this land. So, keyword, descendants. So, file that under important promises, especially since at this point Abram and Sarai have no children. Abram's response is beautiful. He builds an altar to the Lord at each stop, worshiping God who called him. You can sense Abram's relationship with God growing with each step into the new territory. However, the plot thickens as always. A severe famine hits Canaan. Food runs out, and Abram faces his first test in Egypt, land of promise. Instead of staying put and trusting God to provide, Abram decides to sojourn in Egypt for a while, because Egypt has the Nile, a more reliable food source. In fairness, hunger is a pretty strong motivator, and many people would relocate to survive. But this detour to Egypt leads to a sticky situation. As they near Egypt, Abram turns to Sarai and, paraphrasing here, saying, "Look, honey, you're gorgeous or beautiful. When Egyptians see you and find out I'm your husband, they might kill me to take you. So let's do this. Say you're my sister, so they treat me well for your sake and my life." So that's what Abram tells Sarai. So this is Abram's survival plan, a half truth. So, well, actually, Sarai is his half sister according to Genesis 20 verse 12. So it technically is not really lying, but definitely a whole deception. You can almost hear Sarai's skeptical gasp, like, "Really, Abram?" or something like that, but she goes along with it. Sure enough, when they went to Egypt, the locals do notice Sarai's beauty. So 65 years old is the new 25, I guess. Word reaches Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he personally desires to add Sarai to his royal harem. Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's palace, and in exchange, Pharaoh lavishes Abraham, or no, he's not Abraham yet, Abram, with gifts: sheep, cattle, donkeys, camel, and servants. Abram's little ruse appears to be profiting him for the moment. But before we start booing Abram too hard, let's see what God does. So the Lord sends plagues on Pharaoh's household because of Sarai. So the Bible doesn't detail what kind of plagues, maybe a precursor to the famous 10 plagues later. But whatever it was, it got Pharaoh's attention real fast. However, Pharaoh figures out that this mysterious trouble is happening because Sarai is actually Abram's wife. So let's cue in, the awkward royal confrontation. The Pharaoh summons Abram and basically shouts, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she's your wife? Why did you say she's your sister? So I took her to be mine. Now, here's your wife back. Take her and get out." So the Pharaoh is livid, as I would be as well if I was in that situation. Um, I imagine Abram, standing there, head low, muttering, "Sorry." This pagan king rebukes God, or God's man, for lying. Then Pharaoh orders his men to escort Abram and Sarai, and then their entourage out of Egypt. They're basically deported for causing internal or international incident. Number one, the very first one, maybe, at least that we know of here. So Abram returns to Canaan with his wife, safe and ironically with more wealth than before. The Pharaoh let him keep all the livestock and servants he had given. Then among those servants, by the way, is likely an Egyptian maid named Hagar. So remember that name; she will become important later. So God protected Abram and Sarai despite Abram's lapse in judgment. They learned, that truth and trust are better than fear and fibs. It was a rocky side quest, but they're back on track in the promised land. Okay, let's move on to our fun fact corner. Abram's journey from Haran to Canaan was roughly 400 plus miles, done with, all their flocks, herds, and the whole household in tow. It might have taken weeks or months. Like, talk about a moving caravan. This migration mirrors what many nomadic people did, but Abram was driven by a divine call, not just, resource needs. Another fun fact, so at this point, Abram was 75 years old and Sarai was 65. If you're thinking that's pretty old to start, a new adventure, you're definitely wrong. Well, you're not wrong, actually. But in Genesis, lifespans were longer, and God often calls people in what we consider our retirement years. Abram's age makes it clear that the promised child, a great nation coming from him, would truly be a miracle. But then I've also said this, I believe, from the last episode, regarding Noah being 500 years old when he got the calling from God, and then around this time, like the normal, at least for that lineage. Oh wait, was I talking about that already? Yeah. Um, Wait, did I talk about Noah already? Yes, I did, because we're already talking about Abram. Oh my gosh. Um. Anyway, so I'm babbling here now. Okay. So 65 is really not that old, considering people live really old around that time. Is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, so that is it for our fun fact corner. Now let's talk about chapter 13, Abram and Lot, a peaceful parting. So after the whole, Egypt fiasco, Abram returns to Canaan, specifically to the area of Bethel where he had previously built an altar. He basically backtracks to where he last worshipped God, which is a nice touch. Like, he's spiritually resetting. Along with the journey is his nephew Lot, who had been with him from the start. By now, both Abram and Lot are doing very well for themselves. Abram is, very rich in livestock, silver and gold, and Lot also has flocks, herds, and tents. In modern terms, picture two ranches whose herds have multiplied exponentially. The land is crowded with goats and sheep and cows and camels and all that. Soon, problems arise. The land can't support both Abram and Lot's livestock together. I don't know why, but you know. So, grazing areas and water sources are being overused. Tensions flare up among their herders, probably squabbles like, your sheep graze on my side, or, well, your cow drank from our well. I don't know how they squabbled before, but it's family drama meets property dispute. Abram, being the elder and a peacemaker at heart, takes initiative to resolve the conflict. He says to Lot, let's not have strife between your herders and mine. After all, we're kin. The whole land is before you. Let's separate. If you go left, I go right. If you go right, I go left. Like he gives Lot the option. Abram doesn't pull rank. Instead, he just lets his nephew take the first pick of the land. That's a class act of humility and trust. Abraham essentially believes that no matter what Lot chooses, God will take care of him. So, whatever. So now Lot looks around to make his choice. He scans the horizon and sees the Jordan Valley off to the east, near the city of Sodom. That area is lush, green, and well watered. The Bible says it was like the garden of the Lord and like the fertile land of Egypt. In other words, it was the prime real estate, the shiny, attractive option. Lot thinking practically, though, not spiritually, perhaps, says, yes, please, to the Jordan Valley. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and moved his camp eastward toward the city of Sodom. Abraham, meanwhile, stayed in the land of Canaan, the hill country of central Palestine. There's a telling comment in the narrative saying, Lot lived in the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Like, dun dun dun, that's the Bible basically saying, this is not going to end well. Stay tuned. So, Lot is drifting towards a very corrupt culture which will soon test him severely. Lot chose by sight, as modern people would do, but the economics look good. But he didn't consider the moral environment, as again, a lot of people in this modern day do. Anyways, Abram, on the other hand, seems okay with, taking what looks like leftover land, trusting God for the future. After Lot departs, God speaks to Abram again. God says, I'm paraphrasing, Abram, lift up your eyes and look around, north, south, east, west. All the land you see I will give to you and your offspring forever, and I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. If anyone could count the dust, then your descendants could be counted. So, what a reaffirmation. God basically assures Abram, like, you didn't lose out by being generous. In fact, everything around you is yours eventually, and you're still going to have a massive family. Now, keep in mind, Abram still doesn't have even one child. So hearing about, uncountable descendants is mind blowing to, and if you factor in their age as well, it makes it even more mind blowing. It's like God doubling down on the promise. Just when Abram might have wondered if giving Lot first choice meant he got less or a lesser deal. God then encourages Abram, go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. Abram does so, like moving his tent to settle by the oaks of Mamre at Hebron. There, Abram builds yet another altar worshiping God. That's a thing that he does. Where am I? So Hebron will become an important location later. So, spoiler, Abram will eventually be buried there. Anyways, moving on. So chapter 13 ends with Abram, secure and blessed in Canaan, and Lot living among the wicked cities of the plain. They've parted on good terms, avoiding a family feud. Peace is maintained, but challenges are on the horizon. All right, fun fact corner. The well-watered Jordan plain that Lot chose included the region around the Dead Sea, though at the time it wasn't dead. Genesis notes this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, implying that the area was later devastated. We'll see that in, the future episode. Now, prior to that, it was like a tropical paradise. Today, the Dead Sea area is, salty, which many believe is a result of the whole cataclysm that hit Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot was essentially choosing what was then best for the farmland. Another fact, Hebron, where Abram settled, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It will show up again as the site of the cave of Machpelah, the family tomb where Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives would eventually be buried. Even today, it's a significant historical site. Another fact, when Abraham let Lot choose first, it was a remarkable act of faith and generosity. One Bible scholar notes that Abraham knew he could afford to be generous because God had promised to take care of him. So Lot's decision, by contrast, was based purely on what looked good. This contrast birthed a saying, Abraham walked by faith, Lot walked by sight. So Lot's choice led him toward trouble, whereas Abraham trusted, or Abraham's trust led to greater blessing. There's a life lesson right there in the geographical form. All right, that is it for chapter 13. Let's do chapter 14, the battle of the kings and the mystery priest. So, we first thought Genesis was just family stories. Well, half of it. This chapter reads like a historical war drama. It's the first war recorded in the Bible, and it involves a bunch of tough to pronounce kings. So here's the scene. There is what am I trying to say? So I was trying to find the word. So there's a coalition of four powerful kings from the east, led by King Chedorlaomer of Elam. It was hard to say. King Chedorlaomer of Elam. Elam is ancient Persia, roughly modern Iran. So alongside him are kings of Shinar, or Shinar's Babylon, then Elasar and Goyim, basically Mesopotamian alliance. So these four kings have been dominating and exacting tribute from five local kings in the Canaan area, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and kings of three other cities, or no, city-states, which are Admah, Zeboim, and Bela Zoar. So for 12 years, these five Canaanite kings were subjugated, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. So no more tribute to Chedorlaomer. So in the 14th year, Big Boss Chedorlaomer and his three allies march west to crush the rebellion, and they go on a warpath defending various people along the way. Finally, they clash with the rebel coalition in the valley of Siddim near the Dead Sea. It's four kings versus five kings. A real, what's that show? Game of Thrones of the ancient Near East, without the dragons. So Genesis tells us the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen, tar pits. And as the battle turned against the five local kings, some of them fall into these tar pits while fleeing. Imagine death by tar pits. That's a bad way to go. So the rest who survive run for the hills. Sodom and Gomorrah's forces are defeated, and the victors plunder those cities thoroughly. They seize all the goods, food, and sadly, they capture many people as prisoners of war. And one of those captives is Lot. Yep, Lot, Abram's nephew, who was living in Sodom. Suddenly, our family story is caught up in the geopolitical turmoil. One survivor of the battle spares and escapes and runs to inform Abram. Abram, your nephew Lot has been taken captive. Like, how does Abram respond? This is where Uncle Abram goes full action hero mode. Despite being a nomadic herdsman and not a king, Abram has a sizable household and some allies. So he immediately mobilizes 318 trained men born in the household, basically his own private militia. So 318 men, not 300, not 320, but 318. They kept count. Anyway, so together with the Amorite allies, he sets off in pursuit of the invaders. Think about it. Four victorious kings with armies versus one old patriarch with 318 dudes. The odds aren't in Abram's favor on paper, but Abram has something they don't: the element of surprise and the favor of God. Abram's people chases the enemy all the way north to Dan, at the northern tip of Canaan, and then beyond. Then Abram divides his men and launches a night attack. In a brilliant surprise maneuver, Abram's men strike the enemy camp in the dark, throwing them into panic. They defeat those kings soundly. Chedorlaomer, his coalition is routed. Um, Abram and his men rescue Lot, along with all the other captives, and they recover all the looted goods. It's a total victory for the home team, courtesy of the shepherd warrior and his, band of 318. Honestly, it's a cinematic moment. Like, picture torches, clashing swords, and Abram leading the charge like a seasoned general who knew who Grandpa Abram had it in him. Although he wasn't even a father at that point. So I don't know why I called him a grandpa. Probably his age. um, so after this victory, Abram heads back south with the people and goods. Upon his return, he is met by two kings. First is the king of Sodom, who is obviously relieved and grateful, But before that conversation happens, another figure appears. Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Now, this guy is fascinating. Melchizedek comes out to meet Abram with bread and wine. Hospitality and refreshment for Abram's weary fighters. Melchizedek is not only a king but also priest of God Most High. He blesses Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." In other words, he attributes Abram's victory to God's intervention. God gave Abram the win. Abram recognizes Melchizedek's spiritual authority and gives him a tenth, 10% of all the spoils. This is the first mention of tithing in the Bible. Abraham is effectively worshiping God by offering a portion of his loot to God's priest. His appearance is brief but mysterious. His name, Melchizedek, literally means King of Righteousness, and he's the King of Salem, which means peace, and is likely an early name for Jerusalem. Can't talk Jerusalem. So he's, King of Righteousness and King of Peace, and a priest of the one true God. No genealogy, no background story. He just shows up, blesses, and then leaves. So mysterious, this Melchizedek person. Um, Later, biblical writers see Melchizedek as a foreshadowing of Christ, a priest king figure. Some even speculate Melchizedek was a theophany, or an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament, or at least symbol of Jesus. At the very least, he was a Canaanite king who somehow remained loyal to the true God amidst a pagan world, which is, pretty cool. After Melchizedek's blessing and Abram's tithe, the king of Sodom pipes up. He tells Abram, "Give me the people, but you keep the goods for yourself." Essentially, I think I need a drink of water. My throat is getting dry. Anyways, essentially, you deserve a reward. Just return my citizens and you can have all my stuff. A fair offer from a human perspective, but Abram refuses. Now he says, "I have sworn to the Lord, God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you can't say, 'I made Abram rich.'" Abram doesn't want any strings attached or any future boast from the king of Sodom. I wouldn't too. He's like, "Nope, I'm good. I don't want you taking credit for my wealth. God is my source." Abram does make one exception. He asks that his allies take their fair share of the spoils and that his men get some food they consume. But he keeps nothing for himself. This shows great integrity and faith. Abram isn't in it for, personal gain. He just wanted to save Lot and do what was right. The king of Sodom, probably astonished, takes his people and presumably slinks back to rebuild his messy tar pit, city. So Abram returns to his tent in Hebron as not just a wealthy herdsman, but now a respected warrior figure in the region, having shown mercy and valor. And more importantly, he's been blessed by Melchizedek, confirming that God's favor is truly with him. All right, fun fact corner. So Chedorlaomer, or Chedorlaomer, I think is how you're supposed to say it, if I remember correctly. I should have remembered that when I was reading my research. Yeah, I think it's Chedorlaomer. Might sound like a mouthful, but it's actually composed of Elamite words and likely means servant of Lagamar. Lagamar meaning deity. So archaeology and historical texts outside the Bible have records of Elamite kings, and the name is considered authentic to that era. It's one of those details that shows the Genesis writer had knowledge of ancient geopolitics. Another fact, the Valley of Sidim's tar pits were real hazards, like natural asphalt seepages common in that region around the Dead Sea. Um, bitumen or bitumen was used in ancient times for waterproofing. Even Noah's Ark and baby Moses basket used tar pitch. Here, the tar pits acted like nature's traps during the battle. Imagine fighting and suddenly sploosh, like you're stuck in a dinosaur. You'd like a dinosaur in the La Brea tar pits. Definitely not fun. Okay, another fact. This one is about Melchizedek. So Melchizedek has an enduring legacy. His dual role as king and priest was unique. Normally, kings weren't priests, and vice versa. So in Psalm 110, and the Testament book of Hebrews pick up on this, saying that Messiah or Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, meaning Jesus is a king and priest like Melchizedek was. Also, the bread and wine Melchizedek offered Abram have led many Christians to see a symbol of communion, all from this brief cameo in Genesis 14. Like, how's that for an impact, right? Another fact. Need to hurry. We're at 42 minutes. Abraham's 318 men, the trained men, might imply he had a community of maybe 1,000 or more people, counting women and children in this household. This wasn't just a guy in a tent with a pet goat. Abraham was the head of a sizable clan with considerable resources. No wonder the local kings took him seriously. That's it for our fun fact corner. Okay, last one, chapter 15, Covenant Under the Stars. After the adrenaline rush of battle, chapter 15 brings us to a quieter, deeply significant encounter between Abraham and God. It starts with, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. God speaks to Abraham, "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Like, how timely is that? Like, Abraham might have been a bit nervous that those defeated kings could return for revenge. Also, he had just refused loot from Sodom, so God steps in to reassure him, like, "I will protect you like a shield, and I will reward you abundantly." So God basically says, "Fear not, I got you, and I am enough for you." Abraham, however, voices a concern that's been on his heart. He replies, in essence, "Lord God, what good is your reward? I am still childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, my head servant. You haven't given me any offspring, so a servant will inherit anything." Here we see Abraham's honest, even frustrated prayer. God promised to make him a great nation, but as years have passed, Abraham remains without a son. Remember, he's around 80 now at that point, and Sarai is about 70. Biologically, not prime baby time. Abram isn't being ungrateful. He's just yearning for that one thing he and Sarai have longed for, which is a child. It's actually, you know, uh, what am I trying to say? So even with wealth and victory, Abram's heart aches for an heir. God responds with kindness and clarity. This man, Eliezer, will not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir, God says. Then God takes Abram outside and says, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If you can even count them, so shall your descendants be." Imagine Abram, gazing at the Middle Eastern night sky, no city lights, the millions of stars in the Milky Way. I haven't seen so many stars in a while. Anyways, um, so it's overwhelming, and in that moment, something clicks in Abram's soul. He believes God. So in Genesis 15, verse 6 states, "Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness." This is huge. Abram places trust in God's promise, even though it's still unbelievable in human terms, and God essentially stamps Abram's faith account with righteousness. This is the first time the Bible explicitly says someone's faith made them righteous before God. It's like the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, like salvation by faith, not works, right here. Little did Abram know this moment would be famous for millennia to come. Now Abram believes but he's also seeking confirmation. He respectfully asks, "O Lord God, how can I know that I will possess the land?" Um, it's like, I trust you about the offspring, and you've promised me this land. Can I get a sign or a guarantee or a receipt? God doesn't chastise Abram for asking. Instead, God instructs Abram to perform a covenant ritual. Um, and God says, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, plus a turtle dove and a pigeon." Abram gathers these animals. Then, according to the custom of the time, Abram cuts the large animal in half, like literally sews them in two, and lays the halves opposite of each other on the ground. He doesn't cut the birds, but perhaps lay one on each side. Abraham actually knows exactly what to do. He is preparing a covenant ceremony. In those days, when two parties made a serious agreement, they'd sometimes slaughter animals and walk between the pieces, basically saying, "If I break this covenant, may I become like these dead animals." In fact, the Hebrew phrase for making a covenant is karat berit, literally means to cut in covenant. So it's a blood oath, a way of formalizing a promise by life and death. Heavy stuff, but very meaningful in that culture. So Abraham sets up the pieces, then he waits and waits. Birds of prey swoop down, trying to scavenge the carcasses, and Abraham shoos them away. He's waiting for God to show up and sign the covenant, pretty much. As the sun goes away, Abram falls into deep sleep, and a thick, dreadful darkness comes over him. In this semi dream state, God speaks to Abram with a prophetic message. "Know for certain, Abram, that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there, oppressed for 400 years. But I will judge that nation they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. And in the fourth generation, your descendant will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete." That's a download of future news. So to unpack, God is foretelling the story of Israel in Egypt, slavery and the Exodus, like long before it happens. The land not theirs is Egypt. The 400 years of affliction refers to the period Israel will spend there. "I will judge that nation" refers to the plagues and Red Sea deliverance. Come out with great possessions is exactly what happened when the Israelites left Egypt loaded with Egyptian gold. And lastly, is that the last one? No. And fourth generation return here points to the eventual conquest of Canaan under Joshua. God is basically saying your offspring will indeed inherit this land, but not until after a long sojourn elsewhere. I've got a timing, and part of it is that the current inhabitants haven't reached full measure of their wickedness yet. I'm giving them time, but judgment will come, and then your folks will come back to claim this land. It's a sobering prophecy. The promise will be fulfilled, but hardship will precede it. Now, after this heavy revelation, the covenant ceremony reaches its end. Darkness has fully fallen, and suddenly Abram sees a smoking firepot and a flaming torch appear and pass between the pieces of the animal. This is the manifest presence of God. The smoke and fire are symbols of God's glory. Think, the burning bush, the Mount Sinai, the pillar of fire and cloud. The smoke might represent God's holiness and mystery, and the fire, his light and purification. The key thing is, these symbols of God move between the pieces by themselves. Abram does not walk between the pieces. Normally, both parties of a covenant would pass through the seal to seal the deal, but here God is effectively saying, "I'm signing this covenant for both of us." So it's a one-sided promise, unconditional, based on God's faithfulness alone. God is saying, if I fail to keep my word, let me be like these slain animals. Of course, God cannot fail. The visual is for Abraham's assurance. This is profound. God binds himself to the promise. Now, in that moment, the Lord makes a covenant with Abram. God repeats the promise in clear terms. To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. That's a lot of ites. Basically, all the people living in Canaan. So God specifies the broad boundaries of the land and lists the nation that will eventually be displaced for Israel to take possession. The deal is done, not based on Abraham's performance, but on God's oath. When Abraham comes out of this encounter, he must be both, awestruck and comforted. He got the sign he wanted in dramatic fashion. God's promises of an heir and homeland, and are now guaranteed by covenant. Of course, the immediate challenge, no baby yet remains, but Abraham can cling to this night under the stars whenever he doubts. Phew, all right, now onto our fun fact corner. Do I have any? So the prophecy of 400 years of affliction is in a foreign land aligns with Israelites' timeline in Egypt, as I've mentioned. So the fourth generation note is interesting. In fact, Moses, who leads the Exodus, is in the fourth generation from Levi, who is one of Jacob's, sons who entered Egypt. Also, Amorites is often used as a general term for Canaanites. God was patiently waiting over 4 centuries um, before bringing Israel in, giving Canaan's inhabitants time to either repent or fill up the measure of their sins. This shows God's justice and patience. He doesn't judge nations capriciously. That is all I have for my fun fact. It wasn't really fun. It's just, something. um, so before we wrap up, I want to share a little, personal story. So reading about Abraham's journey of faith, especially God calling him to leave home, reminds me of a time I had my own, leap of faith. So a few years ago, 4 years ago, which was 4 years ago, give or take. My daughter was only 6 months old then. I felt a strong nudge to move to a new city. Well, it's not really a new city, like to move back home. Because at that time, I lived far away from home because I was in the military and I had just separated from the military. And I was visiting home. Well, not really home. This is just a place where some of my relatives relatives live, like my aunts, uncles, cousins, live here there, and I visited so they could meet my daughter. So, you know, and I visited for a month. So I was there for a month. And while I was there, that's when I got that kind of, strong nudge from God saying that I have to, move back there. Mind you, I lived in the East Coast around that time, and my family lived in the West Coast. So coast to coast. And, that nudge was telling me to move back all the way to the West Coast, which I did. And it was the best thing that's ever happened to me and my daughter. We moved back home. Now we're closer to family. And, and then if we didn't move, I don't know what would have happened, honestly. I would have been probably miserable. But, in that moment, I felt God encouraging me, saying, do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward, and all that. And then, yeah, opportunities opened as well that I never expected, including my job now that I have, which has been such a blessing. So, um, that experience taught me a spiritual lesson that echoes Abraham. Like sometimes you have to step out of where you are, whether that's your comfort zone, to discover God's bigger plan. So, wherever you are, if you feel God nudging your heart towards something, maybe a new job, reaching out to someone, starting a project, or what have you, take courage, from Abraham. You might be on a brink of something amazing. Faith often feels a bit like standing under a sky of stars, and choosing to believe there's a promise with your name on it, even if you can't count or see it yet. So, what a journey we had today. And guess what? The story is just getting started. So, up to now, Abram has been promised a child, but as of chapter 15, he still doesn't have one. In our next episode, we're going to see Abram and Sarai wrestle with that reality. Sarai, in particular, is going to have a moment of, I need to take matters into my own hands, being impatient. Um, Also, remember that infamous city of Sodom and Gomorrah lurking in the background of our story. You know something's coming on that front. Indeed, next episode, we'll get into one of the Bible's most dramatic and frankly explosive judgments, quite literally. Um, so if you like high stakes and high drama, you won't want to miss episode 4. Stay tuned. The saga of Genesis only intensifies from here. Now, thank you so much for hanging out with me in this episode. It's truly a joy sharing these stories as if we're, just friends chatting about life and all that. I hope you had a laugh, learned a thing or two, and maybe found a spark of inspiration of your own. If you enjoyed this tour through Genesis 11 through 15, be sure to subscribe and maybe even leave a review. Share this with a friend who loves a good story or could use some encouragement because, hey, the Bible is the ultimate story that connects to our stories. Now, in the meantime, remember life can feel like a construction project one day, a battle the next, and a long wait under the stars another. But through it all, we're not alone. The same God who guided Abram is with you, being your shield and great reward. Do not be afraid. Until next time, this is Kaye signing off. Stay blessed, that sense of humor, and keep that sense of humor. And as we see with Abram, don't be afraid to step out of faith. Great adventures await. Catch you in episode 4.